one of the things I just want to kind of warn you of on the front end is this passage is probably one of the most contested passages in the entire book of Matthew. Contested, not maybe that's even like the wrong terminology. There are a variety of viewpoints because there is a lot in here that doesn't seem clear on the front end. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to spend a little bit of time bringing you into sort of like the classroom environment. It's going to be starting off a little bit more like an academic lecture, but don't worry, we're not going to leave it there. I'm not just going to tell you facts about the passage, but we are going to get to a point where we actually preach it and actually unpack for it what it means for us today. So if you have your Bibles, open them up to Matthew chapter 24, verses 1, and we're going to start right away. It says this: Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to the buildings. So if you remember, Jesus has been in the temple in Jerusalem during Passover, having this ongoing confrontation with the Jewish religious establishment. And not only does he have this back and forth with them, but after that finishes, he spends the next, all of chapter 23, basically critiquing the religious establishment to the crowds that are gathered in the temple. And so what happens after this is Jesus and his disciples, they leave the temple. And as they're walking away, his disciples, most of them are country folk, if you know what I mean, country folk. If you're from Souk here this morning, I'm not throwing anything at you. But here's the reality. If you ever go to like the big city, maybe for us, it's like, you're walking through downtown Vancouver and you see all the big skyscrapers and you're like, oh yeah, this is cool. This is different. This is, there's an impressiveness to the grandeur of the architecture. And this is essentially what's happening. All these guys who live in, the rural regions of Galilee, they're in sort of the center of that region in Jerusalem. And the temple was an impressive building. It had massive stones. It was an architectural, feat. And they're here, and they're just kind of a little starstruck. So they call Jesus' attention to the buildings, and then Jesus says this: "Do you see all these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left upon another. Every one will be thrown down." That's a bit of a Debbie Downer move, Jesus. He continues on, it says in Matthew, continues on, verse 3, he says, "As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So Jesus leaves the temple. He makes this offhand comment about how the temple, Jerusalem, all this stuff is going to collapse and crumble. In particular, he's thinking about the temple. And his disciples come to him and they ask him, "Well, Jesus, when is that going to happen? When is that going to happen?" And then they ask him a second question, a follow-up question. "And what's going to be the sign of your coming in the end of the age?" Now, the reason that they package this question together is for them as Jewish believers in the one true God, they can't conceive of a time when the temple would end, and that wouldn't mean the end of the world for them. That's how they're conceiving this. And so they ask these two questions. Now, why this passage becomes a little bit hard to understand is because the thing that people argue about is which of those two questions is Jesus answering when. So if you have your Bibles, really quick, jump up to verse 34, chapter 24, verse 34. And I want you to note this as we continue on. Jesus says in verse 34 to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." That's a pretty explicit statement. If you're wondering what Jesus means by this generation, in the biblical worldview, a generation was roughly 40 years. You think about the generation that passed away in the wilderness in the book of Exodus. They were wandering through the desert for 40 years. So a generation is about 4 years. So what Jesus is saying in verse 34 is everything I've just talked about between verse 4 and verse 34, that's going to take place in the next 40 years. Now, again, we're going to read through this, and you're going to hear some stuff, and you're going to be like, "Oh, that sounds like end of the world type of stuff." But we got to root everything that Jesus says in this statement, in verse 34, that locates it in the next 40 years. So Jesus answers in verse 4, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming, I am the Messiah, and will receive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of the birth pains. If you're anything like me, when you've hit this passage, as you read through the book of Matthew before, your automatic assumption is Jesus is talking about the end of the age. He's talking about the end times, the apocalypse, whatever you want to call it. But we got to root it in what he actually says. And in verse 34, he says, all of these things will take place in the next 40 years. And indeed, if we look at history, what Jesus claims actually did take place. During that 40-year period, it was tumultuous, especially in the region that Jesus was located, in the Judean region. And we had rebels rising up, rebel after rebel against Rome. Rome would come in and crush them. There was warfare happening on Rome's borders. There was, in fact, recorded global big catastrophic earthquakes. There was one in Italy in the 60 ADs. There was one in Asia Minor. There was one in Jerusalem. And that doesn't even include the smaller local earthquakes that we read about in the book of Acts when Paul and Silas are in the Philippian prison. And we even read in the book of Acts about famines that took place in the region. And Jesus calls these things the birth pains. I've never gone through labor, and I'm very thankful for that, but I have watched my wife go through labor. And so for those of you who have gone through labor and you're looking daggers at me right now, being like, tread carefully, I will do my best to tread carefully here. When labor starts, from what I understand and what I observed, it's a little bit sporadic. You get a contraction here, a contraction there. They're far apart. They're not as frequent, and then they kind of vary in intensity. And as you go through the process towards the eventual birth of your child, they become more frequent, more predictable, more intense. And so when Jesus is saying this is the beginning of the birth pains, he's using this picture of labor, and he's saying when you hear about wars, when you hear about earthquakes, that's like the beginning of labor. A contraction here, a contraction there, but don't mistake those for the end. We're not at the destruction of Jerusalem yet. Jesus wants to warn his disciples of what's to come so that they can prepare for it. And we're going to see him fill this out continually as we move forward. Verse 9, he continues, "Then you will be handed over and persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold." So Jesus says, not just will you experience wars and rumors of wars and famine and earthquakes and all of this catastrophic things as sort of a beginning of the birth pains, but you're also going to experience some internal turmoil as a church. You're going to experience persecution. Some of you have probably heard about Nero, Roman emperor. Before Jerusalem was destroyed, which took place in 70 AD, Nero came to power. And Nero thought it was fun to capture Christians and use them as live torches to light his garden or feed them to lions. Some of you have probably read the book of 1 Peter. 1 Peter is writing to churches that are experiencing persecution, ostracization, being pushed to the fringes of society. Some of you probably read the book of Revelation. Revelation written to 7 churches that were undergoing localized persecution. And Jesus says to his disciples, not only are you going to experience before 70 AD local catastrophic events and global catastrophic events, but you're going to experience internal persecution. People are going to hate you. And because of that, it's going to be too intense, and some people are just going to walk away. There's going to be people who come, false prophets, false messiahs, people who claim that they have the answers, that they know the path forward. Maybe they're political leaders or religious leaders, people who are going to come and say, follow us. You don't have to experience all of this. Follow us. We got a better way. This Jesus thing, you don't need it. And of course, again, we read about this. John in his epistles, his letters, he talks about people who have gone out from them who were never part of them. What does that mean? It means there were people who were part of his church that said, we are following Jesus, and then they left and said, yeah, we're not about that life anymore. There's something better out there for us. And Jesus warns them. He says in verse 13, he says, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Jesus wants his disciples to know that difficult times are ahead for them because he's calling them. He's calling them in that season to be faithful, to stay firm with him. It's interesting, if you've grown up in a church environment, anything like I have, probably at one point or another in your life, you've kind of heard someone talk about like the sinner's prayer. This prayer that you kind of say to invite Jesus into your heart. And the way that I conceived of it growing up was, it was kind of like a magical formula. You know, if I say this prayer at some point, I'm in. Like, I actually am obligating God, because I said this prayer, to like bring me into heaven to save me. It's interesting that the Bible actually never talks about this at all in that way. We have passages like this, where what the Bible says is those who persevere till the end will be saved. Don Carson, he's a scholar, and he says this about that statement. He says, if conversion is defined as the change of life that is brought about by repentance and faith that perseveres to the end, then it is quite understandable that there might be another type of conversion which introduces some changes, some transformation, and some tasting of the Spirit and some tasting of grace that does not continue to the end. In other words, apostasy, that's the theological term for someone who walks away from their faith. Apostasy in the New Testament is turning away from a profession you have adopted. It is turning away from a stance, from a profession of faith, from an orientation of light, from a public commitment, from a self-identification that you once made. But in so turning away, you identify that you cannot be real, because the real perseveres by definition. I don't want you to hear something that I'm not saying this. I'm not saying that if someone comes to the end of their life and they've never followed Jesus and they come to a point where they submit to him on their deathbed, that Jesus is like, yeah, no, you didn't live life well to the end, so no. That's not what Jesus is saying here. What Jesus is saying is that the way that you show who you really are is when it actually becomes tough to be that person. It's easy to say, hey, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus, when it's comfortable, when all you have to do is show up on a Sunday and sit in a reclining chair in a theater. But what happens when it actually becomes hard, when the culture around you says, yeah, the things that you believe we don't like, and we're going to deny you access, or in other parts of the country, you actually get killed or beheaded. That's when you know that someone's legit. That's when faithfulness actually shows itself to be true. And this is what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I want you, my church, to know that there are tough times ahead that you are going to experience, because I want you to be able to remain faithful to me through that. Prepare yourselves, root yourselves deeply in me. And then he says something that I think is actually preposterous. In verse 14, he says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Jesus tells his church, you're going to experience persecution. You're going to experience internal turmoil. You're going to experience the world looking like it's collapsing around you, and I want you to be faithful. But I don't just want you to be faithful. I want you to be part of my mission to the nations. Now again, if you read this and you weren't reading it through the lens of what Jesus says in verse 34 about this happening in this generation, it's easy to interpret this as Jesus saying something along the lines of, at the end of the world, when every person and every place has had an opportunity to hear the gospel, then I'm going to come back. Then the end is happening. But that's not actually what Jesus is saying here. The term that he uses to describe the world isn't cosmos. That's like the Greek term for everything. The word is one that actually refers to something like the Roman Empire, like the local gathered body of people. Paul uses a similar phrase in Colossians chapter 1, verse 6, and for sake of time I won't turn there, but he talks about how he's preached the gospel into the whole world. Again, not meaning that every person in every place has happened, because we know at that point, Paul hasn't gone to India, he hasn't gone to Pakistan, he hasn't gone to Indonesia. There are still places today in the world where that statement would not be true if we read it in that way. We have to read it in the way that Jesus actually means it. And so if we go back and we actually look at how Jesus has described the mission for his disciples, we go to places like Matthew chapter 28. Jesus says, "Go therefore into all the world, preaching the gospel, making disciples." In Acts chapter 1, Jesus tells his disciples, "Go therefore out into the world, preaching the gospel, go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Jesus is differentiating spheres. And this is what he's doing here. He's saying it's not just going to stay here. The gospel isn't just going to stay here where I've been proclaiming it in Judea and Samaria and this region. He says it's going to go out into the entire Roman Empire. And we know that by 70 AD, Paul's missionary journeys were complete. The church had spread into most of the known world at that time. The gospel had indeed gone out into all the world. Why does Jesus say this? Because he wants his church to know that not only in this season will they experience hardship for which they are to be faithful, but he's also calling them to something bigger. He's calling them to be used for his mission in the midst of that hardship. That's preposterous. Don't just suffer and try and hold on, but thrive. Be useful. He says in verse 15, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again." In the book of Daniel, chapter 9, Daniel describes this abomination that causes desolation, this horrific, desecrating thing that takes place. And as history shows it, what Daniel described actually took place a couple hundred years before Jesus was around. There was a Syrian king by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, and he, for some reason or another, decided he did not like the Jewish religion, and he, in that point, was controlling the area of Palestine. And so he went on a campaign to try and eradicate it. And it got to a point where he went into the temple and started sacrificing pigs on the altar that was supposed to be dedicated to God. And if you know anything about Jewish faith, you know that pigs are considered an unclean animal. This was the abomination that causes desolation. And Jesus is saying here, everyone at his day and age knows, this is what Daniel was talking about. He's saying, no, that's actually just a picture of what's about to come. What's about to come is going to be the complete and utter desecration and destruction of the temple. Now, if you, again, have kind of looked at this as some sort of futuristic kind of telling of the end of time, and maybe, I don't know about any of you, I grew up reading those Left Behind books. And so Left Behind, I'm thinking this is like some Antichrist type figure who's going in and doing something in the temple. But we can actually tell what Matthew's saying by looking at the parallel passages in the other Gospels. Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience who understood things in kind of pictures and imagery that made sense through their religious background. Luke was not writing to a Jewish audience. And listen to how he describes this exact same scene that Jesus is saying here. He says in verse 20 of chapter 21, "When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that the desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the city get out. Let those who are in the country not enter the city, for this is the time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written." It's explicit here. Jesus is saying what's about to happen is the destruction of Jerusalem. He's saying when that happens, when you see the armies around, when you see that Rome is near, get out of the city because it is going to be catastrophic. Jesus uses extreme hyperbolic language to describe. He says, "For then there will be a great distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now and never to be equaled again." This will be an apocalyptic, earth-shattering, sky falling on your head kind of event. And indeed, if you read the historical accounts written by Josephus of this time, you will only start to imagine what it must have felt like to be in Jerusalem when Rome was sacking the city. The Jewish war, which led eventually to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, started, I think, in 66 AD. And for a couple years, it was a protracted war that happened out in the region, but finally Rome surrounded the city of Jerusalem, and for 5 months they laid siege to it. No food in. Slowly, the city ran out of food, and people started to starve. And in desperation, people would try and flee the city just to sneak out at night and get food. And the Roman garrisons would capture them, and then they would take them to the walls of Jerusalem, and they would crucify them on the walls so that the people inside could hear their slow, dying screams of agony. It got so bad in the city that people were reduced to eating their own feces, and at some extreme moments, they started eating their children. Now just imagine yourself being in that kind of terror. Would you not think, this is never, ever going to get worse than what we're experiencing right now? Jesus telling his disciples this because he is warning them, when you see the armies starting to come around Jerusalem, get out. You don't want to be there. This is my judgment coming to bear on this city. But there isn't just a physical aspect to this reality. There's also a spiritual aspect. This was not just one empire destroying a smaller country or smaller people group. This was the people of God, the Israelites, the ones that God had chosen for himself, watching as their God's judgment fell upon them. Just imagine, again, how you would feel when the center of your entire religious framework, the temple, the place where you offered sacrifices, the place where you would go yearly to meet with God, where the priesthood, the people who were there to intercede with you and God, as all of that disappears in a moment, it would feel like God had abandoned you. And Jesus is saying here, he hasn't abandoned you. I'm warning you. I want you to know what's coming so you can prepare. And he says in verse 22, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, there is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. Josephus records during the siege of Jerusalem, many people came and they even started performing miraculous signs and saying, hey, I'm going to save us. I'm going to get us out of this. I'm going to make things better. And Jesus again says, I want you to know that those people are not me. Don't look to them. They can't do anything for you. He continues on verse 26 and he says, so if anyone tells you there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. if someone says salvation is just around the corner, if this person says, hey, there's this secret guy out in the wilderness, go out to him, or he's just hiding in a room over there, go find him, don't believe it. And then he says in verse 27, for as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there vultures will gather. Jesus uses two word pictures to say, when I show up, you're not going to miss it. When lightning lights up the sky, even if it's come from the opposite direction of where you are, you notice. It's unmistakable. When vultures gather around, you know that something has died. It is an obvious sign. And Jesus says, when I do come, you're not going to miss it. When someone says, Jesus is hiding somewhere out in the wilderness, or he's hiding in some inner room, don't believe it, because when I show up, you will know it. And then he says in verse 29, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now again, if you're listening to that, you're probably thinking that sounds like cosmic end of the world poetry, and that's in fact what it is. Jesus is actually taking images directly out of the Old Testament from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 13, chapter 10, and Isaiah 34:4 to be exact. He's taking these images that Isaiah used to talk about God's wrath and destruction coming on evil nations. In chapter 13, God's wrath falling upon the nation of Babylon as they're destroyed. And we know, of course, historically that happened. The Persians invaded Babylon and took it over. And then in verse 34, he's talking about the destruction of the country of Edom. Jesus borrows this apocalyptic language for God's wrath being poured out on these evil nations, but now he's applying it to Jerusalem. He's saying it's going to be like an earth-shattering, creation-dissolving kind of event. And then verse 30 says, then will appear the Son of Man, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels out with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Probably, if there's any part of this passage that really sounds like it's talking about the end of the world, verses 30 through 31 kind of sound like it. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see it, when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Again, this passage is actually super saturated in Old Testament imagery that Jesus is pulling from to help his audience understand what he's saying. The term the Son of Man comes from the book of Daniel, in particular Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel describes a vision that he has, and there's these series of ferocious beasts that represent the wicked, evil empires of the world that constantly are trampling on God's people. And then it says that after they've done this, one, like the Son of Man, is going to be lifted up to heaven, and there's going to be thrones set up beside the Ancient of Days, beside God. And this one, like the Son of Man, is going to take his place on the throne. And then later, Daniel goes on to describe in chapter 7 how this actually represents God's people being vindicated after being crushed by the nations of the world. Jesus continually refers to himself as the Son of Man. What happens? When we think about the Son of Man coming on the clouds, I think we imagine Jesus coming back again. You know, him kind of sort of coming down from the sky in like a little cloud platform. But the image that Jesus is talking about is not Jesus coming down to earth. It's Jesus going into God's throne room to take up all authority. And what Jesus is actually saying here with this image is that when this happens, you're going to know that I am in charge. When people ask us how we know that Jesus is in charge, what answer would you give? How do we know? I mean, the world is still a mess. There's still lots of bad things happening. How do we know that Jesus is in charge? One of probably the most vital ways that we know that Jesus is in charge is the resurrection. We know that despite the fact that there is still evil, despite the fact that there is still wickedness in the world, despite the fact that there is still a lot of things that we think need to change, we hold on to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. That shows that he has the power over sin, he has the power over death. But if we look at what happened historically, the resurrection was actually a fairly private reality. The people who experienced the resurrected Jesus were people he knew. Paul records that about some 500 people experienced Jesus in his resurrected state before he ascended to heaven. Now you may ask, why does that matter? Well, it matters because how does the rest of the world, the rest of the Jewish people know that Jesus is who he said he was? It's because he was telling them the temple's going to be destroyed. I am going to constitute a new temple of myself. I am going to be the place where heaven and earth meet now. I am going to be the place that generates the new Israel. The temple is going to be replaced by me. And when the temple is finally destroyed, Jesus' claims are vindicated. Jesus tells his disciples this because he knows at that point the Jewish people are actually going to understand his claims to be true. And he says this statement, he says, then the peoples of the earth will mourn. The terms there for peoples of the earth, that's probably the most broadest way that you could translate the words that are being used there. But probably a more faithful way to what Jesus was saying would be the tribes of the land. See, when we say peoples of the earth, it sounds like Jesus is talking about every person, but what he's actually talking about is the people of Israel. He says, the tribes of the land will mourn. The reason that we should understand it that way is because if we look at the language, we actually see it being pulled from Zechariah chapter 12. Zechariah chapter 12 describes how Jesus is pierced by the people of Israel. And when they finally realize what they have done, they will mourn. When Jerusalem falls, and Jesus' words are shown to be true, and you were one of those people who rejected him and pushed him away, there's going to come this moment where you realize, I have actually crucified the person that God sent to save me. And it's going to be a time of great sorrow. Except, even in this moment, Jesus redeems it. Because it says in verse 31, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather the elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. The term angelos, which gets translated as angel oftentimes in the New Testament, simply means messenger. When it's speaking about divine messengers or supernatural messengers, it means angel as we conceive it, some sort of person or being that got sent from God who has sort of supernatural abilities. But it doesn't have to mean that. In this case, this isn't what Jesus is actually talking about. He's not talking about angelic messengers that he's going to send out. He's talking about messengers, his church, that he's going to send out to gather the elect, the people of God from the four corners of the earth. And again, Jesus is pulling from Old Testament imagery, in particular, the covenant that God made with the people of Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 30. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, God says, after Israel has strayed and been faithless, that he will one day draw them back to himself. And so, even in this moment where Israel is falling, they're mourning, it's sad. This day of destruction, Jesus is giving us a note of hope, and he's saying, even despite that, the result of this is that I'm going to bring a new people to myself. I'm going to send out my messengers, my church, into the mission field to find all of those people who are mine. In Matthew chapter 8, Jesus said something that would have shocked his Jewish followers. He said, there's going to come a time when there's this feast. It's a picture of God bringing people back into relationship with himself. And at the table, many will come from east and west. many people will come who aren't Jewish. I think probably almost everyone, if not everyone in here, is not Jewish by heritage. We're here because Jesus sent out his messengers into all the world. That's pretty incredible. Finally, Jesus says this, "Now learn the lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that the summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. For truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." Jesus uses a picture of a fig tree. Probably, we don't necessarily need to use a fig tree to imagine what Jesus is thinking. He's simply saying, when a tree gets its leaves, you know that it's springtime, you know summer's around the corner. So when you see these things happening, when you hear about the wars, the rumors of wars, when you see people leaving the church, when you see false messiahs, false prophets, people trying to lead you astray, when you see armies gathering around Jerusalem, when you see fighting happening, know that these are the signs. Pay attention. Pay attention. Because this is going to happen all in the next 40 years. And then he says this in verse 35. He says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." Why does he say that to his church? Why does he say that to his followers? He says that because he recognizes if they are there alive in that time frame, it is going to look like the world is ending. It is going to feel like everything is falling apart. And he wants them to know that when your world is crashing around you, when it feels like heaven and earth are finally slipping away into the blackness, have hope. Have hope because I am still here. This is a complex passage, and hopefully I've done an okay job of unpacking it for us. I have limited time. There's a lot that I could have said here that, I have like a bazillion scriptural references to show you where all these things are, but for sake of time, I had to kind of jump through this. But I think probably the question we're all asking is, okay, cool, Andrew, that was something that happened in 70 AD or in that 40 years between, the 30s and the 70 AD. What does that have to do with me? I learned a cool historical Bible lesson today. Why does it matter for me? Because even though Jesus was talking to specific people about a specific event that happened years ago, he wasn't just talking about this thing that had sort of some global significance to it. It wasn't just this cosmic event in time. It was something that individual people experienced at a personal level. It was their world ending, their world crashing, and their world falling on their heads. 2020 and the beginning of 2021 has been described by many as a dumpster fire. If you're like me, March 8th or whatever the last Sunday was before we went into our first set of lockdowns, if someone had come to you and said, "Hey, you know what? You're going to have a year where you can't have people in your home and you're not going to be able to gather as a church," I would have laughed in your face. I would have had no ability to even conceive that what we just experienced was possible. And yet, in the last 15, 16 months, we've experienced a global pandemic. We've experienced a significant political unrest. I remember a period of time during the U.S. election, I was scared that there was going to be a civil war breaking out because of the tension that seemed to be growing. We've experienced a tremendous amount of racial tensions, not just in the U.S., but we see that even in Canada. We have seen a massive debt load being taken on. We have seen many people come across and say, "I have the answer, I have the solution." We have false prophets, false messiahs. For many of us, this year has felt like our world is crashing, that it has collapsed in on itself. It feels apocalyptic. And that doesn't even begin to talk about our individual lives. For some of us, your world feels like it's crashing because your marriage fell apart. you lost someone that was really dear to you. You're estranged from your kids. And so your world is falling. It feels like the sun has been darkened, the moon's not giving its light, the stars are falling from heaven. So what does Jesus have to say to us in these end-of-world type of moments that we experience? Let me take us back to what he says to his church in verse 13. He says, "But to the one who stands firm to the end, you will be saved." Jesus' first word for us as we think about our own lives and the ways that we enter into moments where it looks like our world is ending, his first word to us is be faithful. Be faithful. When your world is crashing on its head, when you don't know how you're going to cope, hold fast to Jesus. It's in those moments that your faith actually becomes real, where it becomes proven. But not only that, Jesus has the audacity not just to say, stay faithful, cling to me. He says, I don't just want you to survive, I want you to thrive in those moments. Verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Jesus says, in the midst of your world-crashing moments, I don't just want you to hold on. I actually want to use you. I want to use you. I want you to be fruitful in those moments. I think some of us are hearing that today and we're thinking, geez, I don't think I can do that. I'm barely holding on as it is. How can I be fruitful? But Jesus has this calling on our life. The problem is, we suck at it. It's like honest moment. We're short-sighted. We experience stuff that we don't like, or we get so bogged down in it, and we just can't believe that the end is ever going to come. And so we get discouraged. We want to walk away. Or we just can't handle suffering or pain or inconvenience. We can't see how suffering or inconvenience could actually accomplish anything good, and so we shy away from it in those moments. Or we're easily impressed by people who claim that they have the answer. Political leaders, religious leaders, medical leaders, whatever it is. That they're somehow going to offer us the end solution. Or we're simply just overwhelmed by fear. And we can't imagine that God could actually be in control because our circumstances seem so bad. So how do we actually stay faithful to Jesus? And not just stay faithful to Jesus, but be fruitful in the midst of these moments where our world is crashing in? Well, the first thing that we have to do is take our eyes off of our circumstances and actually put them on Jesus. You know, it's interesting. If we look at Jesus' life, he totally understands this. Think about it. Jesus came to earth. He left the Father. He left the comforts of unity with the Father in heaven. He comes to earth as a person. He builds a following over 3 years. And then what happens? His friends abandon him. His family is distanced from him. His people betray him. And his Father turns his face away from him. Jesus knows what it's like for your world to come crashing on your head because he experienced it on the cross. Jesus experienced what it's like to feel alone. He even experienced what it's like to feel abandoned by God. He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When you feel like, I don't know where God is, know that you are not alone, that Jesus understands it because he experienced it. and he is in this with you. Secondly, Jesus does promise that he's in charge. He explained to his church that when they see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, that means that the Son of Man has come on the clouds, that he is in control, that he is in charge, that he's got this. When we look to Jesus, when we trust that he says what he means, he means what he says, that he's in charge, that changes the way that we actually enter into these dark circumstances. But finally, Jesus also promises that his words will remain, meaning that we have hope that he gets the final word. As bad as your life feels right now, as bad as the world looks right now, Jesus promises that that is not the end, that you have a hope to look forward to. And if nothing else, he invites you to cling to his words. So how do we actually become the type of people who can live this way? Well, we continue to foster spaces in our life where we can actually grow in our belief that these things are true. So we read our Bibles. We get into there. We read the things that Jesus says about himself. We read the things that God predicts through the Old Testament that Jesus will fulfill in and of himself. And we look at those things and internalize them and allow them to boil up in how we interact with the world around us, even in the midst of great difficulty. And we don't just do it alone. We recognize that Jesus didn't just say this to a single person. He said it to a group of people, to a church that was there to encourage each other and foster belief in each other. And so we don't try and do a Lone Ranger Christian life. We actually come together as a body. We don't just show up on Sundays and sit in a chair and say a quick hi to people. We actually invite them into our lives to speak to us, to remind us, to tell us the true story of how the world works when the story that we're being fed is so great that it feels like that's the only one we can buy. We need a counter story, and that's what the church does. This is why we do things like community groups and DNA groups. Those groups are there for us as a church to come together to remind each other of what is true, so that when your world collapses, you have a group of people who can walk through that with you and remind you that you have hope in Jesus, that he has the final word, that he is in control, and that he knows what you have gone through. And finally, we recognize that in the midst of those dark moments that Jesus still is capable and desirous of using us. You know, when the pandemic hit, one of the first things that we saw was people going to grocery stores and ransacking them for meat and toilet paper. Did the church look different? Were we out there protecting ourselves? I'd like to think we did look a little different. One of the things that we as a church did that I think was a bit different than what we saw in the culture is we did something called fill the freezer. Rather than hoarding resources to ourselves, we actually said, how can we be a blessing to this city? Why is that? It's because in the midst of the pandemic, we believed that Jesus was in control. We believed that there was a different ending happening, that he was going to outlive the pandemic. And so we didn't have to worry about self-preservation. That was something we got to do as a church. We got to live a counter story. There's another reality, though. As I said, your faith gets really proven in the midst of difficult circumstances. And when you live in those difficult moments and you're faithful to Jesus, other people take notice. In fact, they probably take notice more than they ever would before. And so when you're in the midst of that relationship that's crumbling, mourning the loss of someone who's been so significant to you, wrestling through the pain of losing purpose from a job loss, or simply just navigating life in the pandemic, know that as you stay faithful to Jesus, he actually wants to use that as a picture of what he's like to the world around you. He doesn't just want you to survive, he actually wants you to thrive. And that is a good God. One of the final ways that we do this is through weekly taking communion together. We have this opportunity as a church to take this cracker and this grape juice. We used to do wine. Hopefully we'll be able to do it again because this grape juice is like really bad Kool-Aid. Every week we have this really amazing opportunity. This can be a trite, symbolic kind of ritual moment for us. But it can also be a moment of rich reflection. It can be a moment where we symbolically tell the world that we actually believe that when the sky is falling on our heads, when our world is crashing, when the apocalypse is here, that we can navigate it because we're holding on to Jesus and what he's done for us. Jesus' body was broken for us. His blood was shed for us. And we remember together as a way of declaring to one another the hope that we have. And so I want to invite the band to come up as we do this. I want to invite you with me. Jesus' body broken for us. Let's eat that in remembrance of him. And Jesus' blood shed for us. Drink it in remembrance of him. Heavenly Father, in the midst of worlds crashing, in the midst of our lives falling apart, in the midst of moments where it just feels like everything we've known is collapsing in on itself, I just pray and ask that you would call us and help us to be prepared so that we can remain faithful, that we can remain rooted in you. Help us not to lose sight of the fact that your words will not fail. And when our moments are dark and we feel alone, help us to remember that you too experienced this, not only with us, but for us, in a way that we will never have to experience because of what you've done. You experienced God's ultimate rejection so that we can experience his ultimate acceptance. Let us hold on to hope in those dark moments. Amen.